My wife and I were sitting on the porch after a long day of moving furniture and boxes into our new home. The sun was setting on the horizon as we sipped our warm beers and looked out over the landscape of our newly acquired ranch. Fields stretched out in the distance as far as the eye could see, not a neighbor in sight for miles. The cows were grazing, looking unhappy, their tails hanging straight down as they ignored the fresh grass all around them. "Do you think they needed so many locks?" my wife asked, taking a sip of her beer. It was the elephant in the room, so to speak, and I had to admit I was curious about it too. Every door in the house had a bolt on it, inside and out. Not only that, but the windows were shielded by thick iron bars the old owners had left long before we could ask them about it. The people who lived here before were probably paranoid about burglars. "So far from the city, we'll take them." "You wanted to redo the trim and the bars on the windows anyway. That'll take a bit more work, but I can get it done before the weekend. I just need to run down to the hardware store and pick up a few things. I can't find some of my tools. Maybe they got lost in the move." My wife wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring off into the distance. "What's that?" I followed her finger and saw a large gray wolf moving across the fields. It seemed to be stalking us, marching at a steady, fast pace. It came to a fence and did the strangest thing. Instead of jumping over it or burrowing under it as I'd expected, it stood up on two legs like a human being, grabbed the loose corner of the wire fence and pulled it up, ducked between the strands and stepped through one leg after the other. It was just as I would have done. Once it was on the other side, it got back on its four legs and started walking towards us again. Then it looked up and saw that I was staring at it. The gray wolf stood still for a few seconds and then disappeared into the tall grass. Suddenly it was just gone. It wasn't there. 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 The two of us sat uneasily on the veranda and I got up to look in the distance, trying to spot the creature, but it was nowhere to be found. "I'm going inside, you should come too," my wife said, sounding nervous. The bars stayed on the windows after that, and my wife never mentioned the dead bolts on the doors in the house again either. The two of us went to bed that night with very little talk between us, a far cry from the ecstatic chatter that had been the norm all day before the event with the wolf or whatever that thing was. I got the feeling that wolf wasn't quite the right word. That night something else even more disturbing happened to both of us. We both woke up in the early hours of the morning around 9 a.m. When I looked in the bed next to me and saw that my wife's place was empty, I immediately became concerned for her safety. Where could she have gone at that time of night, I wondered. Then I heard her voice calling to me from outside the window, insistently begging me to let her in. Her cries for help were muffled by the glass, and I lifted the heavy old pane to hear her better. I looked around for glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight nearby, standing on 2 or 4 legs. I wasn't sure what to expect. "I must have been sleepwalking," she said dreamily. "The front door locked behind me somehow. You've got to let me back in, please. It's cold out here." "I'll be right down," I said without about how impossible it all was. I was only concerned for her safety at that moment, and she had been known to sleepwalk on occasion, so that part seemed to make sense. I raced down the stairs in my boxers, grabbing the front doorknob, turning it. Thank God it was locked. Who knows what might have happened. I reached up to turn the lock. I was startled to hear a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. I jumped at the sound. My heartbeat quickened, but what frightened me more was what I had just seen outside. Given the time it had taken me to get downstairs, what were you doing? It was as if someone else had been out there wearing her skin and speaking in her voice. When I looked at the woman standing in front of me, I had no doubt that it was Christine, my wife, who was panting. I went over to her and hugged her tightly. "What is it?" she asked. I didn't answer, afraid she would think I was losing my mind. There are things we don't share with anyone, not even our significant others. Not even our loved ones. We take them with us to our graves, afraid that if we say them out loud they will become true and the source of the impossible will return. So instead I just took her hand and led her up the stairs, looking nervously over my shoulder at the front door, waiting for the sound of a key turning in the lock or the sound of it being broken down by powerful forces beyond my control. I felt that this was not the same being as the night before. I don't know how I could tell, but I just could. This was not an evil presence. It was just some neighbors coming by to welcome us, and they sounded like they might know something more than we did about the ranch and its secrets. I opened the front door and saw a man and a woman with their backs turned walking away from us. They turned around when they heard the sound of us opening the door. "Oh, hi there. We're the Turns. We live down the road, technically next door, as if there is such a thing out here, but we share an easement with you to access the river. Jack takes the cattle down that way sometimes for a change of scenery." The man put his arm around his wife's shoulder and whispered to her, "Sharon, I'm sure you don't want to get into all that. We just wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood, so to speak. It's nice to have another couple living next door again. This place has been empty for a long time." My wife and I looked at each other in surprise. As far as we knew, the place had been occupied right up until we arrived. There had been no signs of disrepair or neglect. It hadn't shown any signs of disrepair or neglect, so we had no reason to think otherwise. Really no wonder the place was such a bargain. Howling was it empty, for the man and woman shared a look. Oh, you know, not that long, a couple of years anyway. We just wanted to bring this casserole. We've a few errands to run, but it was great meeting you both. Come by our place anytime. We're number the next driveway on your side up that way, the man said, hooking his thumb eastwards. Had never seen anyone introduce themselves and run so quickly. I tried not to take it personally. It was so nice to meet you both, the woman said, taking a few quick steps towards my wife and handing her the casserole dish. You can keep the dish, by the way. It's Pyrex. Great for casseroles. She backed away to join her husband, looking around the property nervously. Can I ask you something? They both looked ready to run back to their car, but they stopped and nodded, shifting on their feet. Have you seen anything? How shall I put this? There have been some strange occurrences since we moved in, and I was just wondering if you could tell us anything. Is this place haunted? Is that why it was so cheap? I can tell you're nervous. Just give us something to work with, please. We're getting a little freaked out. The wife looked pleadingly at her husband. He nodded, and she went back to the car. Wait, no, don't tell me. It's better if we don't talk about it. They know if you talk about it. It's better if we don't. Well then, how do we get rid of it? You don't. These things have been around a lot longer than you and me. My wife and I get our share of strange goings on at the ranch next door, but nothing like this. Here, this place, well, there's something about it that makes it special, and not in a good way. I'm sorry to say I'd tell you more, but it would just make things worse. It always does. There was a sound of Knuckles wrapping himself around the glass, and I looked up to see his wife banging on the car window, looking at us with big eyes and pointing off into the distance at the fields. My eyes followed where she was pointing, and I saw the big gray wolf. I have to go. You two should decide soon if you want to stay. This place will change you, and it will take things away from you. You only have so long to decide. If you wait to see what the changes will be, it will be too late. Trust me on this. He turned away and walked back to his care. He started the engine and drove off much quicker than I would have thought, safe on the dirt driveway, swerving and leaving a cloud of dust around us, obstructing my view for a few seconds. When I turned around, the wolf was much closer. It was about a meter away and was closing fast on us. The wolf was much closer. It was about a meter away and closing fast. It was looking at me intently. My wife ran back towards the house, shouting at me to come, but I was frozen watching the wolf as it stood on its hind legs again. Not a wolf. Stop calling it a wolf. It's not a wolf. It's just trying to trick you into thinking it is, but it's so much more dangerous than that. I tried to take a step, but my legs wouldn't move. My eyes were glued to the wolf as it began to stalk towards me. No longer an animal, but something else, wearing an animal suit. The ancient leather-skinned humanoid underneath the wolf armor could be glimpsed occasionally as it stalked towards me like a hunter, taking long strides, moving low to the ground. The pieces of fur were simply strapped on like clothing, the wolf's head strapped on like a hat. What are you doing? Get in here, my wife yelled once more. More time, and my foot suddenly began to move. As soon as it did, I realized I was unfrozen and finally able to run, and not a second too soon. The house was close, but this thing was fast. When it saw me start to run, it became a wolf again. In an instant, the idea that it was anything but that seemed ludicrous as I watched it race towards me on all fours, its snoring jaws dripping saliva as it did. The veto cut me off. This thing was a massive gray wolf through and through. It could not be anything but that, and yet my eyes had been begging for something else to happen just a moment before. If it hadn't been for my wife, it might have got me. But she saw what was happening and took the big rock we had been using as a doorstop and threw it straight at the thing's head. It missed, hitting the beast in the shoulder instead, but it was enough to drive it back for a brief second, which was all I needed. I ran into the house and slammed the door behind me. An instant later, the scratching began again. Soon another one was scratching at the back door, and the noises continued for hours until I finally ventured out. A moment later, the scratching began again. Soon there was another one at the back door, scratching it too. The sounds continued for hours. When the noises stopped and I finally ventured outside again, I found that 3 of the cattle had been killed. The others were terrified, huddled together in a corner of the field near the house. Their eyes darted across the fields, reminding me of how the neighbors had looked as they searched for the beast, but they had not found it. I began to suspect we wouldn't be able to stay in this place much longer. Even if we could survive, this was no way to live. That night, my wife and I sat in the living room with all the blinds and curtains drawn, discussing what we were going to do. The house wasn't going to sell quickly. That much was obvious from the neighbors' statements. The two of us decided we would leave in the morning anyway. We would stay in a motel until we found a place to rent, sacrificing all our investment in the house. Even if we put it back on the market, it would be a long time before we got any of our money back, but it was too dangerous and too scary to stay. I'm going to bed, my wife said, looking tired. Come up soon. Okay. I don't want to be alone, she said. I'll be up in a minute, I told her. I just wanted to get a glass of water. She nodded sleepily and walked slowly up the stairs looking depressed. We had dreamed of this move for so long and now it was all going to be ruined. I was sad too. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water after drinking it down in one long gulp. I decided I needed another. It had been a long day and I had been too distracted to drink anything. A sound came from upstairs, scraping sound like claws setting. I turned and listened. I turned to look at Christine. She didn't answer. I walked a few steps across the kitchen floor before calling out again. There was no answer. By the time I got to the bottom of the stairs my heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. I opened my mouth to call her name one more time, when Issa, the wolf that wasn't a wolf, 2 legs across the gap at the top of the stairs, then disappeared. Around the corner, towards my wife. It was so fast I thought for a moment I could have imagined it was just a blur, gone in an instant. If not for the fact that it looked down the stairs at me and smiled, its long canine teeth gleaming in the light, its eyes pure blackness. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, terrified of what it would do. When I got to the 2nd floor I looked down the corridor and saw that all the doors were closed. It was as if the whole thing had really been just my imagination. I took an unsteady step towards the bedroom. My heartbeat did not slow down even a little. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it and entered the master bedroom. I entered hesitantly, finding the room dark and my wife asleep in bed. Part of me wanted to wake her, but for some reason I didn't. It will be fine, just go to bed, my irrational thought said. My pounding heart began to slow and my eyelids grew heavy. This is fine, my mind said me. Everything is fine, just go to sleep now. Try not to think about what I saw just moments before. I climbed into bed, getting in next to my wife, shivering as my body warmed under the sheets. There was a soft pattering sound of footsteps outside the bedroom door. Scratching. Something wants to get into the bedroom, and a strange foreign voice in my head telling me to let it in.